knew a bit about antennas from having been in the service working with radar, but that was the extent of it. However, it wasn't necessary to know a great deal about what I was working on. I soon, through the repetition of it, learned all I needed to know about various mechanisms, as we had several of each antenna to work on. It wasn't long before I was assigned to what I considered a gravy job. The standard search radar for the Navy ships was called an SX antenna. But in the shop, in our shop, they had an old SM antenna, which was a forerunner of this more modern one. This SM must have come from early World War II vintage. And they assigned two of us to work on it. Well, this was quite a large structure. It probably stood almost 15 feet high. There was no instructions with it, so all we could go by was what nomenclature existed on the equipment itself, and they wanted this all redone. So we had to make notes and then send the parts to sandblasting and paint shop and redo the whole thing and figure it out as we went to make everything work the way it was originally intended to work. Harrison Luce was the fellow that I was assigned to. He was an older man, but kind of a joy to work with, because he always had such a sense of humor. There was another fellow by the name of Ketchum. I think his first name was Bob. And the three of us were kind of buddies, worked together if I needed a helper. And then there was a fellow in the machine shop. We needed to work with us every once in a while to make a part that had cracked or broken or something. So we were quite a team working on this old antenna, and I'm sure that it was never put into use. Unfortunately, it was a waste of money, but at least I got paid. And at that time, that was all I was concerned about. It was a kind of a job that I really look forward to going to each morning, because there was always something different to do. It wasn't a routine of doing the same assembly over and over again. The kind of job that the rest of the fellows in the group had. Well, since we couldn't live downtown very practically and drive out to Hunters Point to go to work, we needed a place closer, and there was a provision for this in what was called at that time Candlestick Park, or Candlestick Cove rather. This was kind of a cove that was populated by war housing that had been put up for World War II, and it was still there. So we were assigned to an apartment in Candlestick Cove. These were 4-unit apartments. Or 8-unit apartments. I guess there were 8-unit apartments. There were 2 up and 2 down in each half. The most comfortable accommodations we'd had since we left Portland. One of our first acquisitions, as soon as we saved enough money for it, was to buy a television set. A television was just coming into its own in San Francisco. And with a 2.5-year-old daughter, we felt it was important to have something for her to watch, since there wasn't a great lot of recreation available. There were 3 channels in the city, and we were able to get all 3 of them. One of them by adjusting the antenna so that we got a reflection from a hill behind us. The antenna was one that I put on the roof myself, so I was able to adjust it to suit myself. We weren't allowed to put antennas on the roof proper because of the danger of leakage. So I mounted the antenna on the edge of the roof, on the rafter, and bent the piece of conduit so that it came around the edge of the roof and down onto the siding. In order to do this, I had to build a ladder that I could install as needed and get up on top of the roof to fasten the guy wires. Guy wires were all right because they didn't go into the roof itself either. They went into the rafters too. There was another acquisition we made, and that was a tricycle. And this gave Becky a transportation to ride back and forth on the parking apron that was behind the apartments. That was the only place she could go with it. But she made good use of it, riding back and forth, round and round and round and round. I think probably once in a while we'd take her in the tricycle to the park where she had someplace else to ride, but most of the time it was right there beside the apartments. We visited the Raymond Luces a time or two. They lived down the peninsula a ways. It was quite a drive. Something like an hour and a half to get to their place. And all they wanted to do when we got there was to play pinochle. Didn't matter what time of day it was or what the weather was like. They wanted to play pinochle. We played pinochle with them, but we soon found out that the kind of game they played was a game of perfection, in that each player was supposed to remember what every other player had played, so there were no surprises, and this was not the kind of game that we had been used to playing. We wanted to enjoy ourselves and be able to talk a little bit, and for the Luces, this was strictly business. Kept your mind only on the cards. That's all you talked about when you were playing, was the things you could talk about back and forth between players, nothing more. Well, the Ketchums were closer. They lived in Daly City, and we could get to them in less than half an hour. They were young, and they had interests similar to ours. Ketchum's first name was Al. If you want to make a change earlier, I called him something else. I can't remember what it was now. As I say, they had interests closer to ours, and they had a baby. So, can't recall his wife's name, but she and Mary had something they could talk about in common, was children. To bring the Ketchums a little more into perspective, I need to talk about the used (1947) Studebaker, which I bought because I thought it was the only kind of car to have on the road. We still kept the Plymouth because the Studebaker needed some work done on it. And I thought, if I just had a basement where I could work on the engine, I could rebuild the engine and have a real car then. So I talked to Al Ketchum into letting me borrow his basement. They had a typical San Francisco style house where each side was abutting the house next to it. So they lived on the second floor, and their garage was underneath them on the first floor. I could tell that Al was a little reluctant to have me there in his basement. I would think he was afraid I'd make a mess. I think I kept it pretty clean, though. The problem was, when I got the engine all together, I couldn't start it. The starter wouldn't turn it over. So that meant that we had to get a cable or a chain or rope or something and tie it and Al's car together and drag it down the street with it in gear, drag it far enough so that the friction was reduced enough so that we could start it. And eventually I got it to running. Was I glad to hear that engine take off by itself. But guess what the first thing I did was, after that, was to get rid of that car. It was a nice car to drive and shifted well, but it just didn't run the way it should run, because I was really no mechanic. I'd worked on the Plymouth to some extent and knew a little bit about engines, but not that much. As kind of a thank you, before I left San Francisco, I gave Al my very highly esteemed engineer's reference manual, and he was glad to get it because it was something he could use right in his work. Al and I both transferred to the design department, and we're both doing drafting when I left San Francisco. I left Hunters Point Naval Shipyard. To come a little closer to home, to where we lived in Candlestick Cove. Our immediate neighbors were the Hickmans, Barbara and Jerry Hickman, and their little boy Kenny, who played with Becky. He was about the same age. While we were there at Candlestick Cove, I got a bird cage and 2 parakeets. Two parakeets were, one was blue and one was green. And one we called Salty and one we called Pepper. Becky named them. She thought those were good names. They had the run of the apartment, and most of the time we had the windows closed. They would fly around the apartment and lived in the cage and ate in the cage, and were in and out just equal times. But one time, Salty got out, flew out the window. The window happened to be open, and Salty made a beeline out the window. We all ran outdoors to try to get Salty back. And Becky was running up and down the hill, which was behind us, trying to catch her bird. Calling it and wanting it to perch on her finger, but it never did come back. We got another bird, which we called Sugar, but it was never as satisfactory as Salty had been. When we got ready to leave San Francisco, we gave the birds away. We didn't want to. Going to the pet store where we got the parakeets was a treat for Becky, because at the pet store was a large mynah bird. And that mynah bird, when you walked into the store, would say, "Hello, Joe. Want to go to the show? Hello, Joe. Want to go to the show?" Becky thought that was really wonderful, to have a bird that could talk. We tried to teach Salty and Pepper to talk, as you're supposed to be able to, but to no avail. Something else Becky liked to do was go to the park in San Francisco. This was the main park in San Francisco that had everything. Had a carousel, and it had swings and teeter-totters and all the things that little girls love. Carousel was a real carousel, real merry-go-round. You paid your money and rode on the horse. Had your choice of all the horses. This was highlight of Becky's day, of course. highlight of my day was when we went out to the beach. We were beyond the end of the park, and there they had the old-fashioned coin-operated Nickelodeons. You put your nickel in and listen to a tune from the gay 90s. I thought this was wonderful, especially the bigger machines. I think they were a quarter, and you could watch the automatic cymbals and the automatic player piano and automatic drums and the whole thing. Before we left San Francisco, we found it necessary to move because they were going to be tearing down the buildings where we were, tearing down the hill to the north of us to build Candlestick Park. We didn't know it at the time, didn't know what they were going to build, but that was the end result, was the baseball park that's there now. And the hill was right in the middle of where the park would be. That was the hill that gave us the trouble with the television. We had to do most of our receiving with the signal bouncing off the hill behind us. They moved us into a unit which was closer to work, but we didn't like the arrangement as well. We didn't like the class of clientele that were living near us, and we didn't like that time Mary was working. We didn't care particularly for the lady who looked after her. And it wasn't as happy a location, all in all. As I mentioned, I transferred from the antenna department to the design department at the urging of Al Ketchum. I liked the work, but the lack of activity was a problem for me. It was just too sedentary. I wasn't getting the exercise that I needed. Just sitting still all day was not good for me, for my whole physical operation. So I decided that I needed to make a change. I needed to get back to Portland. My father was still raising dahlias. I didn't know how much longer he'd be able to survive doing that. So I decided that I would come back and go into business with him. And I told him as much when I wrote to him. Before we left San Francisco, we got rid of the old Plymouth, got rid of the Studebaker, and got a good used Plymouth, 1949 Plymouth, blue one, and seemed like a Cadillac to me after the two lightweight cars that we'd had. As I say, we packed everything up, gave the birds away, and were ready to travel. Shipped everything in the way of furniture, so all we had was a car to carry some of our closest possessions. and headed for Portland. We did know where we were going to live because my father had taken it upon himself to find a realtor and to find a house for us to live in. The house was at 7021 North Fairport Place, just 2.5 blocks north of the greenhouse. So it was very handy. We thought we knew where we were going to live that first night, going to stay that first night. But there was a mix-up in that the previous tenant was still in the house. But fortunately, his family had left, and it just left he and the dog. So we did have beds to sleep in. And we were in our new home where we were to live for 7 years. One of the first things that I did when I got to Portland was to get together with my father and look over his books for the previous few years to see what kind of income he had from the dahlias, because I knew that the income would have to be increased. There was no way that I could feed my family and him on what he had been making. I just knew that. Well, he showed me his books, and I looked at the bottom line, and I could see right away that I would have to increase the business tenfold. I would have to bring in 10 times as much money as he was bringing in just to barely get by. And I couldn't see how I was going to do that with the amount of ground that was there around the place, around the greenhouse. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that growing dahlias just wasn't in my future. So I gave Dad the unfortunate news. I think Dad took the news pretty hard, but it's hard to tell by looking at him. He just sat there and said, "I guess you're right." Now I need to digress and go back to where Mary and her little daughter, Rebecca, are on the bridge, the Oakland Bay Bridge. I hope I said Oakland Bay Bridge earlier in this narrative and didn't say Golden Gate Bridge, because it was the Oakland Bay Bridge that they were crossing to go to Aunt Florence's, thinking that the boat was going to be going down, working down the coast. Not only did the bridge tender stop all the traffic so that Mary could drive across to where the toll gate was, toll gate office. Of course, the traffic resumed as soon as she did, but all this time, as soon as the gate tender realized that he had the one they were looking for called the marine operator, and the marine operator had left a message for Mary to call the Wendy. Mary had no idea why she was supposed to call the Wendy and was quite concerned. She called the Wendy and was told the news. And this was a culmination of many people working together to bring this about. But it was sure a happy day for me. As I said earlier, I walked on cloud 9 the rest of the day, which is especially hard to do when you're walking on a deck that's moving all the time and there are fish to catch. This is the end of this digression. Now I'll get back to Portland. Since we were already in the house, and since it was agreeable with my father that we stay, and that he would help us financially until we got better situated, as I say, we were settled there, and it turned out to be a 7-year settlement. One of the first things that happened after we got moved in was that Mary's father died. So she and Becky got airline tickets and went to Texas for the funeral. It was quite a sad trip compared to the previous one where her father had taken such a delight in his little granddaughter. I guess the happy news was that, well, they were gone. I went to the employment office downtown, Oregon State Employment Office, and there, among their files, they had a job with IBM. Well, I had heard of IBM, and all that meant to me was computers. So when they told me that it was time equipment, I was surprised that I didn't know IBM dealt in anything but computers. Well, I took the call. I responded to the request for a person to work in time equipment, and I was quite pleasantly surprised at the equipment that I would be working on. It would be time clocks and clock systems, the systems that are predominantly used in school systems, although some of the clock systems are also in downtown buildings. It looked like a fine job to me, and besides that, I was issued a brand new service case with a full set of tools, and that impressed me. The result was that when Mary and Becky returned, they found that Daddy had a full-time job with a respectable company as a customer engineer. This must have had an effect. This news must have had a positive effect on both Mary and Richard, because it was about a year later that our son Douglas was born. The anticipation of a baby being born to her daughter was just too much for Dorothy, and she somehow got the money for a ticket to come up and be there when the baby was born. When it came time to go to the hospital, we were at that time members of the Kaiser hospitalization plan, and the only hospital there was over in Vancouver, Washington. This was a holdover from the days of the shipyard in Vancouver. The only other building there was in Portland. It was just a clinic over on, I think it was Northeast Broadway. Neither Mary nor her mother had any transportation. They got my Aunt Esther to furnish the transportation. So here we have two practical nurses and one very pregnant lady headed for Vancouver, Washington from North Portland. And believe it or not, the bridge went up just as they got on it. They were afraid that they were going to be delivering a child right there in the middle of the river, since things were really moving along so far as the birth was concerned. They made it to the hospital. It was touch and go, but Douglas arrived within about 20 minutes after they arrived at the hospital. He didn't wait around. It was his time to come. So, on June 23rd, 1953, Douglas Allen White was born to the Mary and Richard White family. And those two practical nurses missed out on some excellent practice. Now, this was a fine baby boy who was born to this family and was a delight to his mother. He's always happy, always willing to do whatever his mother wanted him to do, especially if it included getting into the pots and pans in the kitchen. He thought that was more fun than playing with any of his toys. His father fixed him up when he was a little older, fixed him up with a velocipede, which was a converted jumper. He had the canvas seated jumper with a metal frame and base to it, and then his daddy fixed it up with wheels so he could go anywhere in that house and at top speed. Of course, since the house had a basement, it was necessary to build a door, install a door that would keep the velocipede from going down the basement steps. This worked very well until one day the gate didn't get closed. And here came Douglas down the stairs, and right at the base of the stairs, it didn't open out. There was a concrete wall. So he slammed right into that concrete wall and was semi-conscious when his mother got to him. Well, she was quite upset. Fortunately, Father was home. So they piled into the car and headed for the hospital. All the time his mother was yelling to him to stay awake, stay awake, stay with us. Got to the hospital and he had a slight concussion. The biggest after effect was the fact that his nose was broken. But it was a square break right in the middle, Didn't disfigure him, just made his nose broad right at the narrow part. I need to make a break here and go back and make an addition quite a bit back in the narrative. Need to go back to where Mary and Becky visit Texas, the first trip. This would be when we're in Go Get Apartments. So if you can find that. While Mary and Becky were in Texas visiting their grandparents, remember this is when Dorothy borrowed the money to send for plane fare. And Grandpa Allen was so taken with that little girl. But while they were there, Mary had another bout with the fever that she had encountered 2 or 3 times before, and the doctors couldn't find what it was. These were doctors up in this area. She had another bout with this fever, and this time the doctors down there in Texas said, "Why, that's malaria. We know what that is," and immediately prescribed medicine. So this took care of the fever problem. I don't recall whether she had it again after she got home or not, but if she did, she knew what it was and was able to tell the doctors so that she could get a prescription for medicine to counter the malaria. That's the end of this digression. Now we can get back to Doug and his babyhood.